It sets a bad precedent. But again, how do you make sure that the price paid has been high? And if you're not going to have a theory of victory, which requires Russia to be evicted from all the territory that it has invaded, then you're just going to have to make do. Okay, it's unfortunate. Are we going to go to war over the Donbass? And I think the answer clearly has been no. We haven't even provided the Ukrainians with the weapons they needed in order to repel Russia. Again, what was the theory of victory that the Europeans and the United States had? They kept on talking about, we want the Ukrainians to win, we're going to defend them forever. But what, so that they could continue to attrit men and materiel over time? So again, that has been a flaw, I think, from the very start.
I wanted to ask you, Ambassador, about this sense that a lot of people have, certainly on this side of the Atlantic, that maybe the Transatlantic alliance is over, that the historical ties between the US and Europe that have really been in place ever since the end of the Second World War are starting to fray. And I think it probably is fair to say that for too long, Europe has freeloaded essentially off American largesse when it comes to military spending. And Europe has not done enough to pay its own way when it comes to its own security. But do you think this is a moment of fundamental realignment, or do you think that's overstated?
No, I think it is. And I think last week was not just a wake-up call, it was kind of a slap in the face to the Europeans and the manner in which that message was delivered. But this has to be the longest telegraph punch in history, because we can go back to the 1960s with Senator Mike Mansfield trying to introduce legislation requiring the Europeans to spend more money on defense, Barack Obama saying that the Europeans were free riders. Angela Merkel, after her first meeting with Trump, said Europe needed to do more. Macron, for the past few years, saying Europe needs to have strategic autonomy. And Trump during his campaign, saying that the Europeans need to do more, going back to the first Trump term, saying they should spend 2%. And still a third of the Europeans have not met that 2% threshold, importantly, Germany. And so 2% right now is not even on the table. It's 3% is table stakes. And I think that aside from Poland, it's essential that the Europeans rethink how they approach this issue, because it's going to require communicating to the European people, their citizens, that this is a different world right now, and perhaps it means more spending on guns and less on butter. And you can't just do that willy-nilly. You have to bring the people with you in order for it to be sustainable. And so I think the first rule is that you're going to have the European leaders understand that this is a different moment, and that they're going to have to figure out ways to communicate the urgency of that to the people so that they can get public support for some of the difficult choices that are coming.
And do you believe that the European leaders have fully got their heads around that yet? I mean, we had this meeting of European leaders in Paris yesterday, this emergency summit. By all accounts, Keir Starmer in the UK is committed to increasing defence spending a bit further, overruling his finance minister. But again, they're talking about 2.5%, nowhere near the 3% that a lot of people think, as you say, are kind of table stakes to even have a say on this.
No, I don't think that they really do have a sense of urgency. The phrase is denial's not just a river in Egypt. I think they're still hoping that this isn't going to force them to make the very, very difficult decisions that they have to with their budgets at a time when the Trump administration is also threatening tariffs. So I don't underestimate the challenge, but again, this is a quality of leadership that you have to often deliver unpleasant realities to the public and figure out ways to take them with you. And, the administration in Washington did not behave as diplomatically as it could last week. And if you wanted to be charitable, you could say that this is simply the birth pangs of a new administration. And the reason I raise that is because people may forget that the Biden administration did something very, very similar right out of the gates when it took office back in early 2017. They met in Alaska with the Chinese. And Secretary of State Blinken and the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, publicly lambasted, embarrassed the Chinese. And it took the better part of 2 years to get relations back on track again between the US and China, where they could even have meetings and talk with each other properly. So again, I suspect that it was a very difficult week for the Europeans to hear what they heard. I suspect that as the senior officials in Washington get more comfortable with their brief, coordinate their messages better, I'm hoping that any disagreements that we have can better be voiced in private rather than in the public way it was done last week.
But to be clear, this is not something that is purely about the Trump administration. We have reached a point of no return now because, as you explained, Ambassador, people for decades, both Democrats and Republicans, have been saying, look, Europe, you need to spend more on defense, you need to wake up, you need to smell the coffee, and we haven't been doing it. And even if a Democrat were to win in 2028, it's not going back.
I think that's exactly right. And so Trump is an easy target for people to lampoon. But in fact, he is simply the most recent in a long list of American presidents that have been frustrated with the lack of Europeans taking the measures to defend themselves in a way that's adequate with their wealth and their geographic position.
There have been some reports that Donald Trump is prepared to withdraw US troops from Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania as part of this. If that happens, does that not just imperil the security of the Baltic states at a time when you're also worried about the future security of Ukraine?
Yeah, well, I very much hope that that doesn't happen. I think that would be a huge mistake on the part of the United States. I also think, as we all know, that the president says a number of things that it's difficult to evaluate how serious it might be. But I think that when the Trump team thinks through this issue, they're going to realize a couple of things. One is that it is much less expensive for the United States to base its troops in Europe. The Europeans subsidize their housing, their training. We pre-position weapons over there so we don't have to transport them back and forth. We currently don't have housing and training facilities to bring troops back to the United States. So that either means we're going to have to spend more money to create housing and training facilities for the troops we bring home from Europe, or we're going to have to cut our military, which is not what Trump wants to do. So I think that hopefully this will be self-correcting when they think through what the real ramifications are, forgetting the strategic implications. Just simply the budgetary implications of it are not going to be very attractive for the president.
I mean, the fundamental fear a lot of people have in Europe is that the way the mood music is going, whatever the deal is, if a deal can be reached, some kind of peace agreement or ceasefire, it will embolden Vladimir Putin. That he will be able to sell this at home as a win, that he will have expanded the Russian Federation through force, and he will use any cessation in hostilities to rearm, and in a few years' time, he will go again. Do you share that concern?
Well, let me unpack it, because the first one is how is this marketed? Should there be a peace agreement? And a lot of that is up to us as well, denying him the claim that this is a great victory. Let's go back to what he originally wanted to do. He thought within a few days they'd be holding a parade in Kiev after the invasion, and that the Ukrainians would just roll over and accept Russian domination again. That clearly hasn't happened. The economy has been sanctioned out the wazoo. Interest rates are now, 20%? The gas and oil lifeline that Russia has been hard hit with a cutoff to Europe. They are selling things at below market value to the Chinese and Indians in order to have some revenue. This is not a great victory. So if he wants to claim it's a victory, he's allowed to do that, but that doesn't mean he's the only voice out there. And so I think the Russian people realize this has not been a great victory. Oh, and by the way, we haven't even talked about the casualties and the hundreds of thousands of Russians that have been killed and wounded in this, which of course is going to be a living legacy that's going to outlast this phase of the war. So if we allow Putin to get away with saying it's been a great victory for the motherland, that's on us. How do we prevent it from happening again? That's really what this is all about. That's the key issue for me. How do you deter Russia from doing this again? And it could be that it really won't change until Vladimir Putin is no longer in the Kremlin. I mean, again, if we look back to history, the Korean War only ended because Stalin died in 1953. And so, again, Putin can't live forever. It may be that there's a slightly different leader in Moscow. The circumstances may be different. But this is an ongoing conflict that we hope to freeze in a way that allows Ukraine to have a fighting chance to be a successful, independent, sovereign country in the future.
I completely take your point that, it's partly how you sell, how you spin any peace agreement as to whether Vladimir Putin can claim this as a victory. It's a very valid point you raised. But is it not true that ultimately the only way you can defeat an expansionist tyrant, or certainly prevent them expanding further and risking further bloodshed, is to either defeat them militarily or at the very least punish them for their actions? And yet time and time again, we have not done that when it comes to Vladimir Putin. We didn't do it in 2008 with Georgia. We didn't do it in 2014 with the Crimea. And yes, okay, he may not have achieved the total victory he wanted, and there may not be Russian forces in Kyiv, but he has nonetheless expanded his territory through force, and he'll have gotten away with it.
Well, I think that's undebatable. And that's unfortunate for lots of reasons, both for the Ukrainians, but also for the precedent it sets for Europe, for the US, and for China, who's obviously for many, many years been eyeing Taiwan. So it sets a bad precedent. But again, how do you make sure that the price paid has been high? And if you're not going to have a theory of victory, which requires Russia to be evicted from all the territory that it has invaded, then you're just going to have to make do. Okay, it's unfortunate. Are we going to go to war over the Donbass? And I think the answer clearly has been no. We haven't even provided the Ukrainians with the weapons they needed in order to repel Russia. Again, what was the theory of victory that the Europeans and the United States had? They kept on talking about, we want the Ukrainians to win, we're going to defend them forever. But what? So that they could continue to attrit men and materiel over time? So again, that has been a flaw, I think, from the very start. Understandable, perhaps, because of the nuclear threat. That's a different issue. But again, there's been a timidity on the part of the West in terms of allowing the Ukrainians, who, after all, have been absolutely willing to fight and die to defend their territory. There's no issue. There's no question about that. But we have not been as robust in putting that message out to Putin that there is a higher price to be paid. That said, it's a pretty high price they're paying. Hundreds of thousands of Russians dead and wounded, having to conscript North Korean soldiers in order to fight. That didn't work out very well. Okay. And right now, Russia's army is a mere shell of itself. And so, again, how do you end this war? How do you preserve Ukrainian? So now you've added another one. How do you preserve Ukrainian sovereignty? And then how do you deter Russia from doing this again? And more than that, not only how do you punish them for what they've already done? And if you don't think that the punishment that they've suffered is enough, then I'm afraid that there's not a lot more that can be done.
Just finally, Ambassador, the Trump administration is aiming to have some kind of resolution to these peace talks by Easter. Do you think that's realistic?
Well, I'd like to be 6'4", James, but that's not going to happen either. No, I don't think it's realistic. I think that the first thing they need to do, the first rule of any diplomatic engagement, is they need to set up a proper negotiation that's sustainable rather than these ad hoc meetings. There needs to be a process. And I think we're seeing the early stages of that. The key question is going to be how many sides of the table are there going to be, or who's going to be sitting at the table when they convene. So is it going to be Russia on one side and then the US, Ukraine, and the Europeans on the other? Or is it going to be Russia on one side and just the US on the other side? And so I'm hoping very much that it's Russia isolated with the US, Ukraine, and the Europeans, because we're much stronger when we're together. That's always challenging because it's hard to form a consensus. But I think that united front would give us the greatest opportunity to have the type of outcome in Ukraine that we all want to see.
Ambassador Mitchell Reiss, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us again on Frontline.
Thank you, James. My pleasure.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.